Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to the cobblestone nights of medieval Europe, where the stars don't twinkle so much as leer. And beneath your window, a grown man in chainmail is whisper singing in a minor key. You're half asleep. You have chores at sunrise, and yet, here he is again. A knight, apparently noble, definitely bored, and very certain that your complete disinterest is just part of the flirtation ritual. You're not allowed to open the shutters, much less respond. But he doesn't need you to, because in his mind, this entire interaction is already a poem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 15. You're maybe a noble's daughter, maybe just unusually attractive for your village. Either way, someone's decided you're muse material. And as night deepens, you hear it again, the unmistakable twang of a lute. He's back, not with a bouquet, not with food, with verse. You roll your eyes so hard it nearly counts as a prayer. Here's the thing, love poems in the Middle Ages didn't require mutual affection. They didn't even require acknowledgement. In fact, the more aloof you were, the more inspiring he found you. It's not admiration, it's obsession dressed in rhyme. You're not sure who this man is. He might be a second son, meaning he'll inherit nothing, and therefore has plenty of time to practice couplets. Or he might be a knight with a recent injury and far too much free time. Either way, he's convinced he's in love with you. He's also convinced that if he just suffers artistically enough, you'll fall for him too. Mainstream history paints this kind of courtly love as romantic. He rides in armor fights for your honor, writes about your rosebud mouth and alabaster brow. But let's break it down. You've spoken maybe once. You didn't give him permission to write about your body. And honestly, your rosebud mouth is currently chewing on a crust of barley bread. The dissonance is staggering. He calls you his lady, though you're not married, not engaged, and definitely not flattered. And he stands outside your home, reciting verse aloud, like your household isn't trying to sleep. You peek through the shutters. He's wearing a cape. It's not even raining. Historians agree the poetry of this period was not about real connection. It was a social performance. The knight didn't need your actual love, just your symbolic approval. You became a stand-in for moral virtue, for grace, for an ideal he could chase but never have. It sounds noble until you realize it meant he could ignore your no and still claim to adore you. And here's where it gets even more awkward. He writes about your chaste distance, praising how you don't respond, how you remain untouched. He calls it proof of your elegance. You call it, I'm inside pretending not to exist. And that's the creepy part. Your silence becomes the center of the story. Your lack of affection becomes fuel for his art. Remember, you don't have the freedom to protest. This is an era where women are property first of their fathers, then of their husbands. So even if you hated the attention, you couldn't say so publicly. And he knew that. That's what made it safe. He could write anything about your eyes, your figure, your imagined size, and you'd have to bear it quietly. Somehow you're the poem and the prisoner. One fringe tidbit scholars sometimes forget to mention: knights weren't always literate. So many of these poems, ghost-written. That's right, he hired a poet. Some guy in a scriptorium, working for ale, scribbling out stanzas about your amber tresses, while never having seen your face. So, now you're being serenaded by a man reading a love poem he didn't write, inspired by a fantasy you never asked to be part of. Romantic hard pass. You try to ignore him. You bolt the shutters. You avoid the market on days he rides through town. But every time you walk past a group of men, one of them starts humming a familiar tune. It's your poem. He's made it public. Your name's not in it, but everyone knows. Even the local priest nods and says, "It's very chaste." You want to scream, but that's not ladylike. Historians still argue whether women of your station enjoyed this kind of attention. Some believe it offered a sense of power, a chance to inspire something to matter in song, if not in life. Others insist it was oppressive, a velvet cage built from quatrains and metaphors. You suspect the truth is somewhere in between. Maybe some girls liked it, but tonight, with your legs sore from chores and your stomach growling, you just wish he'd go away. Eventually, he does. But not before leaving another scroll at your doorstep. You don't open it. You tuck it in the firewood basket and use it to start the morning flame. Ashes make better fuel than flattery, and poems burn quickly when they weren't written with your voice in mind. You wake up the next morning to the sound of hooves clattering down the lane. Again. Another bard, another morning, another unsolicited melody about the color of your eyebrows, which, for the record, you haven't plucked, styled, or thought about since last Lent. But apparently in someone's dream journal, disguised as poetry, they're arched like the bows of angels, whatever that means. You head outside pretending to sweep the doorstep just as he passes, hoping he'll get the hint. He doesn't. Instead, he bows deeply. The kind of theatrical bow that suggests he's recently been kicked by a horse or is practicing for a pageant. Then he says the words you've come to dread, my lady. I was inspired last night. Of course he was. He unfurls a scroll. You groan. Here's what no one tells you about medieval courtly love. It wasn't about you. It was about him, his emotions, his longing, his pain, his imaginary relationship with the perfect, unattainable woman who looks a lot like you from a distance. You're not a person. You're a plot device. That's the thing with this genre of poetry. It was based on unrequited love, and that was intentional. If you ever did return affection, the poem would be ruined. In fact, the moment you expressed interest, you'd be downgraded from goddess to ordinary. And nobody writes 15 stanzas about ordinary. You go back inside. Your mother eyes you. She's concerned, but not for your feelings. She's worried about reputation. These bards, these knights, these amateur troubadours with a knack for rhyme and zero regard for personal boundaries, they're dragging your name through the court of public opinion. And in this town, that court includes the miller's wife, 3 widows with excellent hearing, and a monk who definitely reads the notes left on your doorstep. You haven't asked for any of this attention, but now people talk, and that can be dangerous. In your world, love isn't about romance. It's about land, livestock, family alliances. If a man wants to court you, he usually talks to your father, not to you, and yet this poetic nonsense bypasses all of that. Worse, it makes you look involved. A girl with too many poems written about her gets labeled, not loved, not admired, labeled. Sometimes the word is coquette, sometimes loose. Either way, it's your reputation that suffers, not his. He, on the other hand, becomes more popular. People admire his passion, his sadness, his ability to rhyme heart with part and depart and torn apart. Historians call it emotional vulnerability in masculine expression. You call it self-indulgent noise that distracts from your chores. Sometimes he writes poems about how you've wounded him, how cruel you are to ignore his gestures, how cold you must be not to respond to his suffering. It doesn't matter that you never invited any of this. In the medieval love poem playbook, your silence is weaponized. The more distant you are, the more tragic and noble he becomes. You, a quiet girl with a laundry list of responsibilities. Him, a wounded warrior crying under the moonlight. You'd roll your eyes, but they're too tired. Let's talk about one of those metaphors. In last night's poem, he compared your smile to a falcon's dive, swift and fatal. You're not sure if he thinks you're graceful or lethal. Either way, it feels vaguely threatening. And this isn't unusual. Medieval poets had a thing for weird comparisons. Your eyes are wells of sorrow. Your lips are sealed tombs. Your love is a battle no man survives. It's less like a valentine and more like a dramatic breakup text written in iambic pentameter. Quirky tidbit: not all love poems were written to real women. Sometimes the muse was entirely fictional. Other times the poet borrowed a name, maybe yours, maybe another noble's daughter, and just ran with it. So now people you've never met are reading about your swan-like neck and breasts, like twin marzipan hills. Lovely. Except you're trying to live a life, not star in someone's fantasy novella. You wonder how many times this has happened before. You wonder if other girls feel this exhausted by other men's imaginations. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever meant to be real. Some say it was performative, a kind of poetic cosplay among elites. Others insist it reflected genuine feelings repressed by the structure of medieval society. Either way, it's starting to feel like your comfort was never part of the equation. You start to hear the poem in other places now, at market, sung by a child, trying to earn tips, in the chapel whispered by some boys who think you don't notice. Even the local tanner quoted it while selling your mother a new belt. He thought it was charming. You start to feel haunted, not by a ghost, but by a rhyme scheme. The worst part, you begin to memorize it, even as you hate it, even as you vow to ignore him, to forget every simile and tortured line about your imagined cruelty. You can't, because medieval love poems weren't written to be private. They were performed, shared, passed around like the village's favorite gossip. They worm into your brain and take root. So now, every time you look in the mirror, a voice in your head sighs, "Ah, the sorrowful blaze of her distant gaze." And you wish you could unhear it. Tonight you try a different tactic. You leave a note on the step where he usually drops his scrolls. It's simple. 3 words. Please stop writing. You sign it with a pebble. No name. It probably won't work, but it feels good to push back even a little. The power of your own sentence, however brief, might not echo through history, but at least it's honest. The next morning, the scroll is still there. Your note, gone. You're not sure what that means. Did he read it and ignore it? Did the wind take it? Did he think it was another poem? Either way, there's a new scroll in its place. You don't even bother untying it. The ribbon is damp with dew. The parchment is sealed with red wax in the shape of a heart, a literal wax heart. Where does he even find those? You toss it unopened into the kindling pile. Today, your breakfast tea is slightly warmer, thanks to a stanza you didn't have to read. But even as the scroll curls in the fire, you can't help but mutter the title. He always includes one, and this one, written in a shaky, overstyled hand, says, "Song of her reluctant flame." You roll your eyes so hard, it gives you a headache. Let's talk about gaze. You know that thing poets love to mention. In medieval love poems, your gaze is a weapon, a balm, a source of spiritual anguish, and sometimes compared to a literal dagger made of moonlight. That's a lot of pressure for 2 eyeballs that mostly just try to find clean laundry. You walk to the well. A local boy, probably no older than you, grins and says, "Your gaze burns brighter than summer noon." You stare at him blankly. He flushes and scurries off. You didn't mean to glare, but apparently your gaze now has a reputation. And it's not one you agreed to. The thing is, medieval romance wasn't subtle. It was structured like a game with rules, and you never got to make them. Rule 1, the man suffers. Rule 2, the woman is aloof, silent, or cruel. Rule 3, the man praises her even more for it. Rule 4, if she reciprocates, the poem ends. Literally. Love poems were designed to linger in longing. Resolution kills the fantasy, which means that the more uncomfortable you become, the more poetic fuel he gets. Now let's bring in the music. Because, of course, it's not just written. It's sung. Badly. He has a lute, or maybe something shaped like a lute and tuned like a cheese grater, and he strums it beneath your window like you're in a sad carnival. The melody off-key, the lyrics tortured. The audience, everyone within a 2-street radius. And just when you think it couldn't get more awkward, he invents a chorus. Oh, flame of sorrow, burn me anew, thy silence more piercing than sword or dew. You don't know what that means. You don't think he does either. But the baker's apprentice hums it as he delivers bread that morning, so apparently it's catchy. Here's a quirky little truth. Courtly love poems were rarely written for the poet's wife. In fact, they were usually about someone else. Sometimes a noble's wife, or a young maiden from a wealthier family, or even a queen. The more impossible the match, the better. That was the whole point. It wasn't about real affection. It was about elevating your own social status through exaggerated devotion. If he was lucky, the subject of the poem would ignore him politely. If he was unlucky, her husband would notice. If he was really unlucky, that husband would be a duke. You, unfortunately, have no dukes in the family, just brothers, who are also bad at poetry. Historians still argue whether these poems were sincere expressions of love or just emotional theater for ambitious young men. Either way, they created a kind of public emotional performance, a loop of admiration, rejection, and endless longing that never quite resolved. And if you were the object of all that attention, you didn't get a curtain call. You were part of the set. You try to write your own poem. Just once. You sit by the hearth with a charcoal stub and scribble lines like, "He speaks of fire, but I am stone. He weeps beneath. I yawn alone." It's not great, but it feels good. You crumple it up before anyone can see. Because if he finds out you can write, he'll just think you're playing along. And that's the last thing you want. Meanwhile, the songs continue. Now there's a second boy joining him. You think they're harmonizing. They're not. One of them has a tambourine. The village priest walks by and gives them a mildly supportive nod. You want to cry, not because of the poems, but because you've become a plot line in someone else's saga, and you were never even asked. You walk to the stream that evening just to be alone. It's quiet, no one around. You pick a flat rock and skip it once, twice, a third time, and then you hear it, the squeak of leather, the clink of armor. You turn around slowly, already bracing. There he is, not saying anything, just watching. You raise an eyebrow. He clears his throat, then whispers, "I'm writing a poem about this moment." You sigh and walk straight into the woods. If he follows, you're going to lead him into the bramble patch. This is the part that modern scholars rarely talk about. The emotional exhaustion of being idealized. It sounds flattering until you realize it's not about who you are. It's about who you aren't allowed to be. You can't be messy, or rude, or bored, or sleepy, or annoyed. You have to be noble, distant, radiant, glowing with unattainable charm. But you're just a girl with a sore back and a long to-do list. You're not his dream. You're his excuse, and you're tired of it. That night you write one more poem. You leave it on the step with no signature. It says, Burn all the songs you wrote for me. Then ask the ashes how I feel. It probably won't stop him, but it might confuse him. And that's a start. The next morning something's changed. You wake up not to the sound of lute strings or clanking footsteps, but to silence. Honest, real silence. For a moment, you wonder if something's wrong. Has he left? Has he fallen into a ravine? Has he finally taken the hint? You allow yourself one selfish hope. Maybe he finally read the poem. But of course, the universe doesn't give up that easily. By midday, a scroll appears, delivered not by him, but by the village blacksmith's apprentice, who looks thoroughly embarrassed as he hands it over with tongs like it might bite him. You untie it with resigned fingers, expecting the usual avalanche of metaphors and misinterpretation. But this one is different. It's short, 8 lines, and it ends with, "If my song offends, I shall sing no more. Yet still your silence sings louder than war." So, now your silence is being poeticized again. Of course it is. You sigh and tuck it under a basket of turnips. If he's going to write about your silence, he might as well enjoy the smell of root vegetables while doing it. Let's talk about personal space, or more accurately, the total lack of it. In the rules of medieval courtly love, a man wasn't supposed to touch the object of his affection. That would ruin the purity of the longing. But what did he do instead? He watched, constantly, longingly, from across the courtyard, from behind a tree, from the back row of Sunday Mass, and always with that intense, unblinking look that says, "I've memorized the back of your head and written 4 verses about your elbows." You're walking home with a basket of herbs when you spot him. He's sitting on a rock, not doing anything, just existing in your direction. You pretend not to see him, but your peripheral vision confirms it. He's holding a quill. You half expect him to write a sonnet about the way your braid swings when you walk. In fact, you know he will. And that's the strangest part. You can now predict the poetry before it's written. Your eyes equals stars. Your footsteps equals harp strings. Your sigh equal the breeze that wrecks his soul. It's exhausting. You want a poem that says she's just trying to get her errands done before sunset. Historians still argue whether courtly love served any practical purpose for women. Some say it allowed women a symbolic power in a society that otherwise denied them autonomy. But others point out that it came with a price. You had to be perfect, silent, graceful, untouchable, and grateful for the attention. Which means, if you ever said, "Please leave me alone," you weren't mysterious anymore. You were rude. You were a villain in someone's romance. You became the reason the story ended badly. There's a word they used back then, dolor. It means deep sorrow, grief, yearning. It appears in almost every love poem. But somehow, your sorrow never gets a verse. Your discomfort, not poetic enough. Your unease doesn't rhyme with maiden. Your need for space, too modern, apparently. And the metaphors, they get weirder. You find one scroll left on the laundry line. It compares your patience to the slow carving of saints from stone. Another, tucked into the breadbasket, calls your hair the ropes by which my soul is bound. What are you supposed to do with that? Never untangle it again. You wonder how many other girls are reading verses like these and wondering if they've somehow been roped into someone else's emotional play. Because this doesn't feel like affection. It feels like appropriation. Your image, your presence, your existence, used as a kind of poetic canvas for someone else's drama. A quirky little tidbit. In some regions, these love poems were exchanged secretly between married women and men who weren't their husbands. It was a way to flirt without physically touching, like emotional theater behind society's back. But that doesn't help you now. You're not married. You're not interested. You just want to hang your laundry without being turned into a lyrical allegory for patience. You visit the chapel to light a candle. Inside, the quiet is sacred, safe, until you notice something scribbled on the underside of the pew. It's a line from a poem, his poem, etched into the wood. You don't know whether to laugh or weep. Even God's house isn't off limits for iambic invasions. You think of writing a poem back, one with your own metaphors. Maybe something like, he sings of me beneath my eaves, but all I want's a day of peace. His rhymes grow long, my temper short. I dream of boots with heels that thwart. It's not elegant, but it's honest. But you don't send it, because if you do, he'll think it's a sign that you're secretly participating, that you like being someone's poetic inspiration. So you let it stay in your drawer next to an old candle stub and some frayed ribbon. Because right now, the only thing more exhausting than being adored is being expected to adore back. Later that day, a neighbor, one of the older women with a knowing glint, says, "You should be flattered. A man with a lute is better than one with a sword." You don't argue, but you can't help thinking, a sword at least doesn't follow you around singing. And unlike swords, these verses leave a wound that doesn't bleed. That night, as you lie in bed, the moonlight casts long shadows across your blanket. You stare at the ceiling and think, this isn't about love. It's about longing, longing that never ends, that feeds itself, that imagines you as a statue, and then complains that statues don't respond. And you realize finally what it feels like to be immortalized, not in marble, but in someone else's melodrama. There's a new rumor in the village. They say someone saw your name on a parchment passed around the market square. Not a legal scroll, not a land dispute, a poem. And not just a poem, an illustrated one. Someone apparently took the liberty of drawing you, draped in metaphorical vines, eyes cast toward heaven, lips parted in eternal longing. The drawing doesn't even look like you. Your chin isn't that pointy, and you've never worn your hair in that weirdly regal braid. But none of that matters. People recognize the name. Yours. It started. You're becoming a symbol, and not a symbol you chose. In courtly love culture, women weren't just written about, they were elevated, placed on impossible pedestals, not for who they were, but for what they represented: chastity, purity, noble suffering. The perfect love object wasn't supposed to speak too much, or move too much, or have too many opinions. She was meant to inspire. And by inspire, they really meant be beautiful and distant while someone else did all the talking. So, congratulations. You're officially an ideal. Even if your feet hurt, your dress is muddy, and your real opinions would cause half the village to faint. And now the artists have joined the poets. Yesterday someone tried to sketch your profile in the dirt with a stick. Today the blacksmith's son carved your initials into a tree, yours and his. You don't even know his name. By tomorrow they'll probably name a cow after you, maybe even a storm. The attention isn't flattering anymore, if it ever was. It's invasive. You start to feel like a walking idea instead of a person. People don't greet you anymore. They bow, not out of respect, but because it's expected when addressing a lady of verse. Let's pause on that for a moment. The pedestal. In these poems, women were compared to saints, angels, stars, unreachable moons. You weren't supposed to reciprocate affection. You were supposed to beam down approval from a spiritual distance, which is a polite way of saying don't touch, don't talk, and don't have thoughts of your own. You begin to understand the danger of the pedestal. It's just a prettier version of a cage. Quirky fact: in southern France, some troubadours wrote elaborate poems to married noble women and addressed them only by nicknames like Lady Mirror or She Who Refuses. The poems circulated widely, and if you guessed wrong about who the real woman was, it was socially dangerous. But tantalizing, it was poetry as gossip. And guess what? Your name isn't even masked. You don't get the luxury of an alias. Just your real name handed from lips to lips, like a folk tale with no ending. Historians still debate whether the women in these poems had any power at all. Some say being idealized gave them leverage, made them immune to criticism. Others argue the idealization itself silenced them, turning them into living altars, not people. You know how it feels. It feels like being erased behind a curtain of compliments. And the worst part, the compliments don't even land anymore. How many times can someone call your smile the gateway to divine mercy before it starts sounding like they've never spoken to an actual human being? You start to wonder what would happen if you broke the rules. Not big rules, just the poetic ones. What if the next time he sees you, you frown? What if you say something sarcastic? What if you sneeze? Or, heaven forbid, tell him you don't even like poetry? Would the illusion shatter? Would the song stop? Would he realize he's in love with a version of you that doesn't exist? Or would he double down, writing even more tragic verses about how you've fallen from grace? You suspect the latter, because this was never about you. It was about his story and your role in it. You go to the well again, hoping for just 5 minutes of anonymity. A woman nods at you and whispers, "You're lucky. Not every girl gets her own poem. You nod politely. But inside you think not every girl wants one. Not when the poem is a set of expectations disguised as praise. Not when your real voice gets quieter every time someone rhymes beauty with duty. Later, a local girl barely 12 asks shyly if you're in love. You almost choke on your bread. No, you say. She looks surprised, but the poems say you are. You want to scream. Instead, you say, poems say a lot of things. And in that moment, you realize something else. You're being written into other people's dreams. And you never ask to be in any of them. That night, you hear him again, softly, distantly, somewhere near the barn. He's not singing now, just speaking lines under his breath like he's practicing for a performance. You don't listen closely. You just shut the window. And for the first time in weeks, you sleep without dreaming of rhymes. The next morning, there's parchment under your door. Again. You stare at it for a full minute before touching it, as if maybe this time it'll burst into flames out of sheer embarrassment. But it doesn't. Of course not. It's very much intact, sealed with the same overdramatic wax heart as always. You consider tossing it unopened. You consider burning it with yesterday's cooking scraps. But curiosity wins, reluctantly. You peel it open. It begins as usual in the second person, addressing you not by name, but as light of my torment and the echo of joy in my desolation. You mutter under your breath, echo this. It goes on for 17 lines before it even gets to a verb. And then, somewhere in the middle of the fourth stanza, he writes, though you deny me, still I serve, bound not by hope, but by oath and nerve. Oath and nerve. You scoff. He's comparing your lack of interest to a trial by fire, as if ignoring him is an act of cruelty. And that's the thing. This whole genre, the courtly love poem, is built on denial as devotion. The more you reject, the more he insists. The colder you grow, the more he burns. It's not love. It's emotional siege, warfare. Let's talk about contracts. Not legal ones, though. Marriage contracts do exist, filed in neat rows at the local priory, but emotional ones written in verse. Because that's what this really is. He's created an imaginary agreement. He writes poetry, suffers theatrically, and in return, you're supposed to grant him what exactly? Affection, acknowledgement. A glance from the window. You never signed this deal, but you're already in default. You remember something strange the baker's daughter told you once. He said he'd die if I didn't smile. She laughed when she said it like it was sweet, like it was romantic. But it wasn't. It was manipulation. It was pressure, wrapped in rhyme. How many girls have been told that their silence is someone else's sorrow? How many have been handed metaphors like chains? And that's where the you can't just back out part begins. Because poetic love in the medieval world wasn't just a moment, it was a performance, a role. And once you were cast in it, even silence became a kind of dialogue. You don't say yes, that's fuel for a tragedy. You don't say no, that's hope for a future stanza. Either way, your absence becomes presence. Your non-participation becomes sacred mystery. And soon your neighbors look at you like you're part of the story. Not just the subject of a poem, but a character, trapped in a narrative you didn't author. There's something deeply unsettling about that, especially when you pass the tailor's boy and he gives you a knowing wink, not because of anything you said, but because of something someone else wrote. Suddenly your reputation has a life of its own, and that life is poetic, which means it's wildly inaccurate and suspiciously scented with lavender and longing. Historians still debate the real-world power of these verses. Some say they elevated women by placing them at the center of cultural attention. Others point out that the poems never asked for consent. They assumed admiration was a favor, not a burden. One fringe scholar even argues that the poems acted like contracts without witnesses, non-binding on paper, but socially enforced through storytelling. You don't need historians to tell you what it feels like. It feels like obligation disguised as art. You walk to the market. It's unusually quiet. Then you realize people are staring, not whispering, not smirking, just watching, as if you've stepped out of parchment and into real life. You want to scream, "I'm not a verse," but all you can do is clutch your basket tighter and keep walking. Because the moment you react angrily, sarcastically, humanly, you'll be accused of breaking the spell, of being unworthy of the pedestal, of ruining someone else's poetic journey. That night, you write your own scroll, not a poem, just a list of things you'd rather be than a poetic muse, a weaver of scratchy wool, a healer with stinky herbs, a woman with unwashed hair and no metaphors, a completely normal human being with no allegorical birds nesting in her eyes. You read it once, then burn it. Not because you're ashamed, but because you're not writing it for anyone else. It's the first time in weeks you've written something only for you. And here's the quiet truth no troubadour ever puts in a poem. Sometimes the greatest romance is the one you walk away from. Sometimes love poems are just traps written in pretty ink. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your own heart is to let theirs stay broken. You decide it's time to visit the orchard, not for any poetic reason, just because the pears are overripe and someone has to pick them before the bees do. You don't bring a basket. You don't wear your good shoes. You don't expect a serenade. But when you arrive, of course, he's already there, sitting beneath the oldest tree, like he's posing for a painting that hasn't been commissioned yet. His lute rests against his knee. His cloak is arranged just so. You get the feeling he's been waiting for hours, not just for you, but for the right angle of sunlight to hit his cheekbone. He rises slowly. You raise a hand before he can speak. Don't you say. He falters, and for a second the illusion wobbles. His shoulders shift, his mouth opens, then closes. The poet is caught without a verse. You bend down, pluck a pear, bite it. It's tart. He watches you eat in silence, which frankly is an improvement. You sit under a different tree. He follows at a distance, but miracle of miracles doesn't say anything, just tunes the lute absently, letting the strings hum a soft dissonance. It's oddly bearable, like a background noise you stop noticing. This is the quietest he's ever been, and that in itself is suspicious, because troubadours are performers, and a performer in silence is just an audience member waiting for applause. In medieval times, love was considered a moral test. Poets wrote about it as though the woman's indifference was a trial sent from heaven. The man had to endure it with nobility, writing verses instead of demanding answers. But somewhere along the way, the line blurred. Longing became entitlement. The poet believed his devotion earned something. Not affection necessarily, but acknowledgement, validation, a glance, a half smile, a line of verse in return. And when that didn't come, he'd write louder. Not angrier, no courtly love forbade open rage, but louder in metaphor. More birds, more stars, more suffering that somehow made him the victim. Even when all you did was pick a pear. You finish eating, wipe your fingers on your skirt, stand to leave. He speaks, softly like someone testing the depth of a frozen pond. I dreamed you were blue. You blink. That's not a very good poem, you say. He flushes. It wasn't a poem. It was just a dream, you nod. Then walk away. And in the distance behind you, you hear it, the unmistakable scratching of pen on parchment. Of course he's writing it down. Here's a fringe tidbit you won't find in most textbooks. Some medieval women wrote back. Anonymous verses survive, written in a different hand with a sharper tone. Some scholars suspect they were replies. Some were even satirical. One reads, "You see my eyes and dream of pain. I see your poems and groan again." Another, scratched into a chapel wall, simply says, "Not everything with a face is your muse." You wish you had written that one. Historians still argue whether women in these stories loved being adored. Some point to diaries where noble women confessed enjoying the attention, even encouraging it. Others point out that those women had power, wealth, security names that protected them. You have none of those things. You have a garden, a wooden spoon, and an increasingly frayed patience. You're not a countess. You're the girl who just wants to live without rhymes. It's been quiet for a few days now. No new scrolls, no musical ambushes, just a few curious looks in the market, and one poorly drawn sketch of your foot, someone pinned to the bakery door. You removed it and gave it to a piglet who ate it without complaint. You think it might be over until you wake to find a package, not a scroll, not a letter, but an actual gift wrapped in linen. Inside, a ribbon, the same color as the cloak you wore last week, and a note. You dropped this, or perhaps you gave it. Either way, I carry it now. You didn't drop it, you didn't give it. But now apparently you've gifted a token of affection. You sit on the edge of your bed and press the linen against your forehead. It smells like pine and stubborn delusion. You want to write something back. Not cruel, not sharp, just clear. Maybe something like, "This is not a story. I am not your chapter. I am not here to teach you longing," but you don't. Because the moment you send a scroll, the cycle restarts. And you're so tired of beginnings. So you carry the ribbon to the well, drop it in, watch it sink. No poetry, no ceremony, just fabric meeting water. You turn, walk home. And for the first time in weeks, no one calls you my sorrow. No one recites anything near your ears. And the air feels clean, almost like silence. Real silence. Not the kind that waits for a verse to fill it, but the kind that just lets you exist. The village has moved on. At least, that's what it seems like. No new scrolls on your doorstep. No lute music leaking through your shutters. The baker has stopped winking. Even the blacksmith's son, bless his sweet, confused heart, has erased your initials from the tree and replaced them with his own name next to goat. Small victories. You should feel relieved. Instead, you feel untethered. Not because you miss him. Let's be clear, your blood pressure drops every day that passes without a metaphor. But because now you see what all of it really was, a mirror. One he held up not to see you, but to see his own yearning, wrapped in a shape he liked. And now that it's over, you wonder, what happens to the story when the poet stops writing? You spend the day cleaning your cottage. The dust is thick in places you haven't touched in weeks, between beams, behind baskets, under your own sense of patience. You find 3 forgotten scrolls wedged behind the firewood. You don't open them. You burn them. The flames curl around the words you'll never read. You feel lighter. Let's talk about the disappearance. In courtly love literature, there was often a moment when the lady vanished, either because she married someone else, or joined a convent, or simply withdrew. When that happened, the poet didn't stop writing. He wrote more, but the tone changed. Suddenly she became the lost star. The silent bell, the saint beyond reach. And you realize with a quiet sigh that silence was never freedom in those stories. It was just fuel. Your absence would never be absence. It would be mystery. And mystery was irresistible. So you stop being mysterious. You start being loud in the most ordinary ways. You talk to the carpenter about roof tiles. You haggle with the herb seller over dried thyme. You stomp when you walk across the market square. You smile too wide. You laugh too much. You become deliberately, joyfully unpoetic. And for a moment, it works. You are finally boring, unrhymed, undramatic, which is to say free. There's a quirky tidbit here. In one village chronicle, a poet was fined by a local magistrate for excessive and unsolicited verses after he carved his lover's name into the church altar using pig's blood. The woman in question. She eventually became the town's first female miller. She said she preferred flour to flattery. You get it. Historians still argue over whether these love stories ever reflected real life. Some say they were purely aspirational fairy tales of passion and virtue. Others argue they warped the way people saw real relationships, creating an impossible ideal of what love should feel like: constant longing, endless drama, no room for comfort. But you're no longer interested in theories. You're interested in quiet. And maybe one day, something gentler. Not fire, not poetry. Just a person who sees you for who you are and doesn't try to turn that into a metaphor. That evening, as you rinse your hands in the basin, you see movement outside your window. A figure, not him, a different man, older. He's carrying a bundle of firewood. You open the door before he can knock. He looks surprised. I wasn't sure if anyone lived here anymore. You smile. I live here. He nods. The roof's crooked. I know. I fix roof. You consider this, then step aside. He enters without fanfare, without poetry, without a lute. He smells like ash and pine resin, and doesn't say anything else as he kneels to examine the beam. You sit in the corner and watch the orange firelight play across the wood grain. And for the first time, someone is in your house, doing not watching. He's not performing. He's repairing. Later, he leaves with a nod. No scrolls, no carved initials, no metaphors trailing in his wake. Just the faint scent of smoke and something solid. You don't know if he'll come back, but you hope he does. Not because he sees your sorrow, but because he saw the roof. You sleep well. No music, no rhymes, no performances under your window. Just the wind steady and quiet. And you think maybe love doesn't begin in longing. Maybe it begins in silence that asks nothing of you and gives you room to be real. You wake up to the sound of soft knocking, not the dramatic rap of someone with a poem to perform. Just 3 calm knocks, almost polite. You stretch, yawn, and for the first time in weeks, you don't brace yourself for a sonnet ambush. When you open the door, it's the same man from yesterday, the roof fixer. He holds up a small bag of nails and some thatch. "Morning," he says. "Thought I'd finish the job." You blink. You came back. He shrugs. "Said I would, that's it. No metaphor. No dramatic pauses. No comparing your eyes to holy water or storm clouds." You let him in. As he works, you return to your chores. Not dainty ones, the ones that require elbow grease. Scrubbing pots, tending fire, sweeping stubborn ashes. You don't try to look elegant doing it. You just do it. And every so often you notice him glance your way. Not the way poets do with that hungry, dreamy look, but with curiosity, respect, like he's cataloging facts, not feelings. Let's talk about consent medieval style. Because despite all the poetry, all the oaths and serenades, consent in courtly love was murky at best. Yes, technically the lady had to say yes, but saying no often wasn't allowed to stand as a full sentence. Rejection was interpreted as part of the dance, a step, not a stop. Poets wrote no as the beginning of passion, not the boundary of it. That sounds romantic on parchment. In real life, it's exhausting. You know this firsthand. You've said no more times than you can count. And still they came scrolls, song sighs. You've never said yes. But somehow, the story wrote you in anyway. There is a moment where the roof fixer pauses, wipes sweat from his brow, and says, "Mind if I open the window?" You nod. He opens it. You didn't expect the simple question to hit you so hard, because in all those weeks of poetry, no one asked you anything that small. They asked you to be an inspiration, a muse, a source of divine suffering. But no one asked if you wanted fresh air. Outside, the world is just doing its thing. Chickens scratch at the ground. A child chases a dog. A woman shouts about onions. And for once, none of it feels like a metaphor. You lean your forehead against the doorframe and breathe. The breeze is ordinary, a little dusty, a little sweet. It smells like something real. Quirky fact, in certain regions of medieval Italy, poets were licensed, yes, officially licensed to perform in courts. And if they overstepped, wrote unapproved verses, or falsely represented a noblewoman, they could lose their license and be exiled from courtly gatherings. But in the countryside, there were no such rules. Just hungry men with ink-stained fingers and a talent for pretending suffering was sacred. You suspect your bard was one of those? A man whose verses were too much even for the court. Historians still argue whether courtly love poetry was ever intended to lead to real relationships. Some say it was a safe outlet for passion in societies where marriage was arranged and women were cloistered. Others believe it normalized a pattern of yearning without responsibility. Men who adored from afar, but disappeared the moment reality arrived. You've seen both. You've lived both. You've come to appreciate someone who stays even when there's no rhyme in it. The man finishes patching the last of the roof. He doesn't ask for anything. No dinner, no praise, no poem. He just says, "Won't leak next rain." You nod. "Thank you." Then, after a pause, "Would you like some bread?" He smiles. "Sure." You break bread in silence. It's not sacred silence, just quiet, comfortable. He eats like a man who works with his hands. You eat like someone who has finally found space. There's a different kind of love growing in this space, not the courtly kind, the quiet kind. It doesn't declare itself. It doesn't demand to be known. It just shows up with nails and thatch and fixes the part of your life that actually needed fixing. You finish your meal. He stands. "I'll come by next week. That chimney's leaning." You smile, I noticed. He leaves without another word, and the door closes gently. Not like an ending, but like a pause. You sit by the fire that evening and think about all the verses you'll never receive again. You don't miss them, not even a little, because for the first time someone looked at your roof instead of your eyes. And that might be the most romantic thing that's happened all year. The next day there's a scroll on your doorstep. Your heart sinks a little. Not in fear, not even in dread, just in exhaustion. You thought the scrolls were gone, that you'd finally earned some peace, that maybe, just maybe, metaphors had given up on you. You pick it up slowly, almost gently. The wax seal is unfamiliar, not a heart, not an emblem, just plain red smudged at the edges. You open it. Inside a poem, of course, but this one's different. Short, clumsy, almost shy. If you see this, I hope you smile. I wrote it fast. It's not my style. The pears were good. I hope there's more. Also, your roof has one loose door. You blink, then smile. Because it's not about your eyes, or your voice, or your soul burning in divine torment. It's about pears and the roof. You fold the scroll and tuck it into the corner of your hearth, not because it's precious, but because it's honest. And that's more than you can say for most verses that have ever landed at your feet. Now let's talk about virginity, because we have to. Medieval love poems were obsessed with it. You were either the pure, unreachable muse or the fallen, forgotten one. The metaphor only worked if you stayed at one extreme or the other. And purity wasn't just a social status, it was poetic fuel. The untouched were the most inspiring, the most divine, and therefore the most trapped. You weren't a person, you were a concept, a flame behind stained glass, an idea people could project onto. And the moment you stepped out of that role, wore a dress too low, laughed too loud, lived too fully, you lost your value in their stories. Suddenly you weren't worth the rhyme. You became a warning, a footnote, a fall from grace etched in 10 stanzas of regret. The most uncomfortable truth, many poets never wanted you to say yes. They didn't want love. They wanted longing, the kind that stretches across years and scrolls and aching sighs, because that's easier to control than a real person. Someone who talks back, who wants different things, who might reject the entire premise of a metaphor. Real love. Messy, warm, loud, unfinished, didn't belong in these verses. Only perfect love, which meant by default, imaginary love. Quirky tidbit. In some early French poetry, poets used disturbing metaphors for virginity, like a sealed garden or an unbroken chalice. And once that seal was gone, the tone changed completely. The muse was now tainted, and the poet righteously heartbroken, even if he'd been the one begging to break the seal in the first place. Historians still argue whether these metaphors shaped cultural norms or simply reflected them. Either way, they reinforced a dangerous idea that women existed to represent ideals, not live them. But you are no one's garden, no one's chalice, no one's emblem of divine restraint. You're a person. And you're beginning to realize just how much of your life has been narrated by other people's rhymes. Even your silence was a character. Even your absence became a symbol. No more. That evening you sit outside with a pear in one hand and your feet in the grass. You've decided to start writing not for anyone else, not for posterity, just for you. You grab the back of an old scroll, one of his, probably, and turn it over. On the blank side you scrawl, I am not your sorrow. I am not your muse. I am not a poem you forgot how to lose. You don't burn it. You tuck it inside a jar. Let it live there, quiet and unspectacular, real. And then the roofman returns, not with scrolls, with nails. He fixes the door he mentioned, doesn't ask permission, just starts working while you dig weeds from the garden. When he finishes, he hands you a hinge. Replace the old one. You hold it like a relic. Cool, solid, heavy. Thank you. He nods. You ever need help? I'm usually by the river after dusk. Fishing. You pause. Fishing. He shrugs. Not well. You laugh. I'm not poetic either. He smiles. Good. Then he leaves. No dramatic exit, just footsteps fading and the quiet, ordinary sound of a life not written in verse. You stay in the garden until the sky turns silver, and you realize the most beautiful thing someone has ever given you is nothing, no metaphors, no expectations, just space to live, to speak, to exist without needing to rhyme. You find the lute under your bed, not because you put it there. Someone must have tucked it away during the scroll storm weeks, or maybe it wandered there on its own, like a guilty conscience wrapped in strings. Either way, it's dusty. One of the pegs is cracked, and you're almost certain the lowest string is made from horsehair. You lift it like it might bite. Then, sitting cross-legged on the floor, you pluck a string. The sound is mournful. Predictably, you pluck another. Worse. It's the sound of 1,000 sighs and one too many metaphors trying to fit inside the same couplet. It's also wildly out of tune. You don't hate it, though. You just don't trust it. In a strange, sneaky way, you've come to appreciate the quiet. The days have become soft, unrhymed, each one folding gently into the next like clean linens or unremarkable dreams. And you're not bored. You're safe. But part of you still flinches when a bird sings too sweetly outside your window. You've been trained by verses to suspect beauty. You expect it to come with conditions. Here's a historical fact that'll make you raise a tired eyebrow. By the late Middle Ages, there was a whole genre of poetry written by men who were basically sad boys with quills, long drawn-out laments about unrequited love, epic stanzas of despair, entire volumes dedicated to women who never spoke to them. One French nobleman wrote 3,000 lines about a woman who once dropped her glove near him. That's not devotion. That's an obsession with your own emotions. And in case you're wondering, no, he never actually spoke to her. She married someone else, quietly, happily. Meanwhile, his manuscript is still in a museum, untouched, unread, like the glove. Historians still debate whether these poets were being sincere or if they were performative, leaning into a popular cultural trend of tortured masculinity. Some say it was cathartic. Others believe it turned male vulnerability into a performance that still centered them, even in the name of heartbreak. And you think it doesn't really matter, because either way, you ended up in the background. The woman-shaped silhouette on a pedestal. Not a person, just a theme. You carry the lute outside, sit under the pear tree. Not to be poetic, just because it's shady. You start tuning the strings, slowly, badly. You don't know what you're doing, but it feels good, like you're reclaiming a language that once told lies in your name. A bird joins in, not metaphorically, just literally. It perches above, sings a messy tune. You try to match its pitch. Fail. Laugh. Try again. And suddenly this instrument that used to be a tool for unwanted attention becomes something else. Yours. Not a performance. Just a noise. Something true. Quirky tidbit time in some medieval manuscripts. Women are shown playing lutes. Not many, but enough to suggest that the instrument wasn't always used by men serenading balconies. Sometimes it was for dancing, for joy, for fun, not longing, not loss, not literary angst, just rhythm and fingers and a little bit of mischief. You like that. You play a few more notes. They're clumsy, unmelodic, perfect. That evening, the roof fixer walks by. He doesn't stop, but he hears you. He raises a hand, keeps walking, doesn't shout, doesn't wave dramatically, just a quiet gesture to say, I see you, not as a muse, not as a symbol, just you, with a dusty lute and a paracord at your feet. You strum a final chord and set the lute down beside you. The strings hum once more, a soft little sigh like they're relieved to be useful without being dramatic. And you lean back against the tree, stretch your arms, and let out a real sigh, one with no metaphor attached. No poet would write this moment. It's not tragic enough, not star-crossed, not soaked in symbolism. It's just a girl in the dirt with calloused hands and a stolen instrument trying to remember how to play. And maybe that's what healing is. Not silence, not solitude, but learning to make noise, again, your way. You're halfway through a very off-key version of something that might be a melody if you squint and cover your ears. When you hear someone behind you say, you're holding the lute upside down. You jump, turn, and there she is, a woman, around your age, dusty sandals, ink stains on her sleeves, a satchel so full of parchment it's bursting at the seams. There's a feather quill stuck in her hair, like she forgot it was there 2 days ago, and simply decided to move on with her life. You blink. Excuse me. She points again. The lute, wrong way up. You look down. She's right. You flip it. She nods, satisfied. Then she plops onto the grass next to you and takes out an apple like you've been friends for years. Turns out she's a writer, not a traveling bard, not a commissioned court poet, just someone who writes because she wants to. She tells you this in a voice that's fast and full of tangents, like her words have been waiting for someone to catch them. She says she's been kicked out of 2 villages already, one for writing a parody of a priest's sermon, the other for composing a poem in which a nobleman was compared unfavorably to a soggy loaf of rye bread. You love her immediately. She asks if anyone's ever written poems about you. You hesitate. She sees it. Then she says, "Let me guess, long ones, rhymed, full of metaphors about light and sorrow and bees trapped in amber." You groan. She grins. "Yeah, you look like someone they'd do that to." She pulls out a small scroll, unrolls it, clears her throat, and proceeds to read a poem, one she wrote, about herself, in which she boldly declares that her hair is mediocre, her feet weirdly shaped, and her favorite pastime is petty revenge. It's terrible and brilliant. This is a turning point. You've never met a woman who writes poems for herself, who doesn't wait to be admired or compared to a flower or assigned a role in someone else's size. She writes about mud, about sour beer, about that time she was stung by a bee and spent 3 hours trying to write an angry ode to insects. You realize maybe for the first time that poetry doesn't have to be a weapon, or a trap, or a mirror someone holds up to make you feel small and sacred and untouchable. It can be funny, messy, utterly useless, and still worth writing. Quirky tidbit. There were a handful of women in medieval Europe who wrote back, sometimes anonymously, sometimes under a man's name, sometimes boldly in their own voice. One wrote a series of rebuttals to famous love poems, changing every compliment into an insult. When a man wrote, "Your eyes burn me like the stars," she replied, "Then stop staring at them and get a hobby." Her scrolls were banned, of course, which only made them more popular. Historians still argue whether these women had formal education, secret patrons, or just really stubborn personalities. You suspect it was mostly the last one. You and your new friend sit until the sun begins to dip. She's written 3 haikus about a worm you didn't notice. You've tuned the lute slightly better, and in that shared silence, something shifts. You realize the love poems written to you were never really about you. But this feels different. Not worship, not performance, just companionship. Before she leaves, she hands you a scrap of parchment. On it, you are not a metaphor. You are the punchline to a joke I like too much to stop telling. You laugh. You fold it carefully, tuck it behind your hearth scroll, and for the first time in a long time you feel seen. Not lit from behind like a stained glass window, but seen like a person. A full sentence, not just a line break in someone else's poem. Later, you sit by the fire and try to write something of your own. It's not elegant, it doesn't rhyme, but it begins like this. Today I met a girl who eats apples too loudly and laughs like she's breaking a curse. And that's enough. You wake up the next morning to laughter in the village square. Not the usual polite chuckles or the occasional cackles of the gossip bench ladies. No, this is full-on belly-holding, spit-out-your-bread laughter, the kind that bounces off cobblestones and makes even the cows pause mid-chew. You shuffle outside in your boots hair, a mess apron askew. And there it is, a puppet show. Yes, a puppet show, staged on 2 overturned barrels and a laundry line strung with painted fabric. The backdrop is crooked, the puppets are slightly terrifying, and the whole setup is leaning so far to one side, you're amazed it hasn't collapsed under the weight of sheer enthusiasm. And in the middle of it all, your new poet friend. She's crouched behind the barrels, working 2 sock-like characters with gusto. One puppet has a lute, the other has a scroll, and they are clearly painfully based on certain bards you may or may not have dodged recently. You sit down on the edge of a trough, stunned. The villagers are loving it. The puppets flail dramatically. Behold, the scroll puppet cries in a nasally falsetto. My love burns like fermented goat's milk. Lute puppet swoons. Your similes, they make me weep into my tunic. Scroll puppet, let me compare your elbows to swans. Lute puppet, the crowd erupts. You can't stop laughing. It's not just the parody, it's the freedom of it, the audacity of mocking something that once held you hostage in rhyme. This used to be sacred, heavy, performed in hushed reverence. Now it's being skewered by a puppet with a crooked mustache. And it's glorious. Here's a fun historical tidbit. Medieval towns often had traveling players, theater troupes, minstrels, and yes, puppeteers who told bawdy versions of popular court stories. They mocked knights, they exaggerated noble affairs, and they absolutely tore apart sappy love poems. It was peasant catharsis, public therapy via sock puppet. And for once, the audience wasn't just watching, they were laughing. With you, not at you. Historians still debate how much of these performances were tolerated by the church or nobility. Some scholars say they were ignored as low art. Others argue they were intentionally subversive, offering critique disguised as comedy. Either way, they gave voice to the voiceless. You wonder how many other women laughed for the first time, watching someone make fun of the poem that once made them cry. Back in the square, the puppet show takes a wild turn. The scroll puppet declares eternal love. The lute puppet throws a turnip at him. They duel with wooden spoons. Someone throws a cabbage, a goat eats the backdrop. It's chaos. It's perfection. Your friend takes a dramatic bow at the end, holding both puppets aloft like victorious gladiators. The crowd claps and hoots and tosses coins into a wooden bowl. You toss in a pair. She winks. Later, you help her pack up. What made you do that, you ask? She shrugs. Had the idea while peeling onions. Felt like justice. You laugh. It was justice. She pauses. You know you could do this too. What puppets know? Write back. Make noise. Tell your version. You fidget with the edge of a glove. They never wanted my version. Exactly. That's why it'll shake the floorboards. Quirky fact: in some Italian villages, female poets would read sarcastic verses aloud during festivals, anonymously mocking the men who'd written love poems in their names. These shadow poets became legends. No one knew their real identities, but everyone knew their words. And in those words, the balance shifted just a little. Not enough to flip the world, but enough to let a woman breathe without being turned into a metaphor. That night you light a candle and pull out a fresh scroll. You stare at the blank page. It doesn't feel intimidating anymore. Just open. You write. If you write me into a poem, I'll write back with a puppet, and it will win. Then you smile, because it's true, and maybe from now on that's the rule. If someone tries to turn your life into a tragedy, you respond with satire, and maybe a goat. You're in the market when you hear it. A voice not singing, not reciting, but booming. Loud enough to bounce off barrels and spill the cabbages. You freeze, turn, and there he is. Not a bard, not a poet, a knight. Full armor, horse snorting, cloak flowing like he practices entrances in the mirror, and in one hand a parchment so large it takes both arms to unfurl. The townspeople gather, whisper, giggle. He clears his throat and begins to read. It's a poem about you. Of course. You groan, ready to walk away, but then something catches your ear. The poem isn't about your eyes, or your soul, or the time you once sneezed during church, and he felt the tremor of God's affection. It's about victory. He declares that winning your favor will prove his worth, that claiming your heart will silence his rivals, that your acceptance will raise his name above all others. You blink. It's not a love poem. It's a trophy application. You slink behind a fruit stall, listening in horror. Every stanza is full of conquest metaphors. Your heart is a fortress. Your smile is a blade. Your refusal is an act of war. He ends the performance by throwing a gauntlet to the ground. The crowd claps out of confusion. You duck deeper behind the pears. Here's your historical fact. During the late medieval period, it was common for nobles to write love poems, not for actual romance, but to elevate their political status. A well-placed sonnet could curry favor with higher lords or gain sympathy in disputes. In many cases, wooing was more about showing dominance than expressing emotion, and women often didn't even know they were part of the game. Your name in a poem could lead to challenges, duels, even property disputes, all because someone decided your virtue was good PR. Quirky tidbit. One nobleman used love poems to publicly shame a rival. He wrote that his lady's scarf had been insulted by a coward who wouldn't defend her in a duel. The poem circulated until the accused actually moved towns. Was the scarf real? Unclear. Was the woman consulted? Definitely not. Historians still argue how much women benefited from these poetic power plays. Some gained influence. Others were forced into marriages or alliances based on the narrative written about them, not by them. You stare at the knight still posing dramatically beside his horse. Someone offers him bread. He refuses. I feast only when her heart yields. Oh, good grief. You step out from behind the fruit stand and shout, "My heart's closed for maintenance." Gasps, laughter. The night blinks. My lady. You point to the pear you're holding. This fruit has more emotional availability than you. Good day. Then you walk away. No flounce, just brisk irritation. You hear applause. Whether for the drama or the pear line, you don't care. You said it. That's enough. Back home you collapse into a chair and rub your temples. You thought the poetry phase was over, but now the stakes are higher. No longer love-struck boys with lutes. Now it's armored men with egos, and worse, audiences. Because once a poem leaves someone's lips, it becomes a tool, a rumor, a performance, a piece of propaganda. And you're tired of being the poster girl for someone else's ambition. Later, your poet friend arrives with a bottle of something sweet and probably fermented. You tell her what happened. She listens quiet at first, then bursts into laughter. You should have thrown the pear. I thought about it. She nods. Next time throw it and say, "Here's your emotional support fruit." You both cackle until your cheeks hurt. Then she says, "You know, you could write back again." To him, no. To the crowd. Let them hear your side. You hesitate, but then she pulls out her satchel and slaps down a scroll blank, waiting, and you know you have to. That night, under candlelight, you write your first public verse. Not a love poem, not a retort, a manifesto. It starts like this: I am not a contest. I am not your ladder rung. If you climb, fall fast. The view from here is mine. You post it in the square the next morning. By noon, it's copied 4 times. By dusk, someone sets it to music on a recorder with 1 broken note. You don't care. Let it echo. Let it sting. Maybe next time they'll think twice before turning your life into a conquest rhyme. The next morning, you find a fresh copy of your manifesto pinned to the baker's wall, next to the sourdough prices, under the lost goat notice, and beside it, bold, pretentious, and obviously written with too much wax seal, is another poem, a response, from someone named Sir Alric of the North Wind Vale, who you've never met. His verse opens with "Fair lady of ink and defiance, thy scroll cut deep like wheat scythe, undo." You don't finish reading because you already know the game. Sir Alric doesn't want you. He wants a brand. And in this town, being linked to the girl who writes scrolls that go semi-viral is the best reputation polish a man with mediocre sword skills can get. You exhale slowly. Not again. Here's a fun fact to make you smirk into your tea. During the late Middle Ages, noblemen who couldn't win battles would often try to win relevance through literary performance. Commissioning love poems became a status move, like buying a horse you didn't know how to ride. Some didn't even write them. They hired poets. And you can always tell which ones. They're the verses that rhyme soul with bowl and use 3 metaphors for hair in a single stanza. Sir Alric's poem rhymes valor with pallor. You rest your case. Your poet friend reads it and nearly snorts her cider. Do you think he practices these in front of a mirror with a fur cloak? You shrug. Or into the ear of his favorite sheep. She gasps. Blasphemy. You both laugh until your eyes water. Then she goes quiet. You know, she says gently, you're not wrong to be annoyed, but you're also visible now. And for some of them, that's enough to try and co-opt your voice. You stare at the parchment, at the neat calligraphy, at the elaborate initials. He signed it with 3 titles and a family crest. It's not about you. It never was. Historians still argue how much influence poetry truly had in medieval power dynamics. Some believe it was just flowery noise decorative. Others argue that poems were part of a larger toolkit of influence used by ambitious nobles to gain favor at court, secure marriages, or make veiled threats. You believe the second group, because poetry, when done right or wrong, spreads faster than bread gossip, stickier than jam, more dangerous than a loose horse in the grain field. Quirky tidbit: there were literal scroll wars in some courts, men publicly posting verses on church doors, castle gates, or bathhouse walls, competing for attention. The winner wasn't always the best poet, just the loudest. One particularly infamous war ended with a duel involving hurled cheese wheels. You're not making that up. You're only wishing you'd been there to witness it. The next morning, you start seeing more poems. On barrels, on walls, in flour sacks, all signed by different names, different wax seals, different fake humility, all quoting your lines. Some twist your words to sound tragic. Some rephrase them as flirty. One turns your rejection into a secret affection, which makes you gag so hard you nearly drop your bucket. They're not writing to you. They're writing with you, or rather, over you, using your voice as scaffolding. Because now, being adjacent to your name is fashionable. Romantic rebellion is in vogue, and you're the muse again. This time you don't write a poem, you host a reading. On market day, you stand in the square, climb a crate, and unroll a scroll. Then you read every ridiculous thing written about you that week with full theatrical flair and exaggerated voices. The townspeople howl, the children clap. Your poet friend provides dramatic background lute, and after every stanza you pause and say, "Permission never granted." At the end, you bow, drop the scroll dramatically into the bucket of goat water, walk off to roaring applause. Later that evening, a girl approaches you, young, shy, holds out a folded parchment. Inside a poem about herself. It's messy, choppy, not great. But the last 2 lines are, "I used to think I needed a knight. Now I think I just needed a pen." You smile, hand it back. "No edits," you say, "it's already perfect." And for the first time in weeks, your words don't feel stolen or twisted. They feel shared. That's worth more than any scroll hung on a noble's wall. That's a legacy. You're sipping tepid soup one of those quiet evenings where nothing explodes or gets posted on a tree when someone knocks. Not a rap, A tap. Cautious. You open the door. No one. Just a small folded parchment on your doorstep, held down by a perfectly round stone. On the parchment, a single sentence. I know your window faces west. You stare at it. The handwriting is unfamiliar, neat, controlled, nervous. You flip the parchment over. Blank. Inside, also blank. Your soup goes cold. The next day, another note. Tied to your gate with twine. Your laugh yesterday at the market. I wrote it down. Twice. Okay, that's a choice. The third note is longer. Rambling. Odd. They mention watching you feed your chickens, which is already unnerving. Then go on to compare your chicken scooping posture to a Roman goddess. You genuinely don't know which part is worse. Now you're checking over your shoulder. Now you're pulling curtains during breakfast. Now you're wondering, is this another poem or a problem? Because this one's different. This one is hiding. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe had no shortage of anonymous love letters, unsigned scrolls, and secret notes, often slipped under doors or tucked into laundry baskets. Some were harmless flirtations, some were socially risky, and some bordered on obsession. There are recorded cases where anonymous sonnets led to full court trials. One poor woman in Florence had to testify that she was not secretly married to a poet who claimed her in verse. His evidence, 4 odes and a lock of hair she never gave him. Your quirky tidbit. One man in 15th century France wrote daily poems to a woman he'd never met. When she didn't respond, he accused her of emotional theft in a public rhyme. She countered by hiring a juggler to recite his worst verses at the tavern out of order. That juggler made good money for months. Historians still argue whether the notes were ever meant to be romantic or just a form of surveillance in pretty wrapping. You think it's the second. You start cataloging the notes. You don't show your poet friend right away. You're not sure how. What if she laughs? What if she doesn't? By the time you hit note 11, which reads only, I heard your boots today, you snap. You write a reply. Not to them, to yourself. It begins, you think this is affection. I call it haunting in verse form. And you feel better. Until note 12 arrives. In your laundry basket, you bring everything to your poet friend. She reads in silence, then folds her hands. We burn these, she says. You hesitate. Shouldn't we reply? She shakes her head. There's no reply that's not fuel. You don't want a conversation. You want space. So you do. Together. Each note tossed into a fire with a soft as the ink curls into ash. You expect relief. But what you feel is sadness. Not for the notes, but for how often affection is disguised as attention, as possession, as watching, when what you craved all along was to be heard, not observed. Later your friend says, you know, We should host a scroll safety workshop. You blink. That's not a real thing. It is now. You hold the first meeting under the giant oak tree. You teach young girls to write decoy scrolls with lines like, "My heart is a haunted forest, closed for seasonal maintenance." You show them how to trace handwriting, to spot recycled metaphors, to say no in 3 languages and a smirk. One girl raises her hand. "Can I write a poem that just says no 100 times?" "Yes," you say. In fact, write it in bold. The final tip you give. If someone leaves notes and hides their name, they don't want to love you. They want to own your silence. You pause. Then say, "Make noise anyway." They clap. And your poet friend says quietly, "That might be the most important line you've ever written." You shrug. It's not even in iambic pentameter. She laughs. Exactly. A storm rolls in just before market day. Not one of those poetic, brooding mists that makes your window look extra tragic. No, this is a soggy apocalypse, complete with thunder cracks that sound like angry gods rearranging furniture upstairs. And somehow, in the middle of it, someone posts a new poem on your door, in red ink, on damp parchment. By morning, it's streaked, smeared, and everyone has already read it. You open the door in your nightdress and squint. At first, the words are blurry. Then, you make out a line. She seduced him with silence, then struck with shame. Your stomach drops. You read on. It's about a woman who weaponized poetry, turned love into humiliation, and left men emasculated by metaphor. Your name isn't mentioned, but your scrolls are quoted, word for word. It's not a love poem. It's a smear campaign. Mainstream fact in medieval Europe. Poetry didn't just serve as love letters or self-aggrandizing verse. It was used in public feuds, accusations, and even legal disputes. You could libel someone with a rhyme, and if the crowd sided with the poet, your reputation could crumble before your rebuttal dried. These were the original subtweets, but in cursive, and read aloud by street performers. Quirky tidbit: one poet accused a rival of using rotten metaphors and limp similes in a public verse. The accused replied with an epic poem that included a recipe for literary revenge stew, which featured 2 drops of talent and a whole turnip of ego. They performed it with hand puppets. The crowd picked sides. The feud lasted 3 winters. Historians still argue whether either poem was any good. You sit at your table, the red-inked parchment trembling in your hands. It's not that the poem stings. It's that others are quoting it. Suddenly, you're not the scroll girl who speaks up. You're that one who broke Sir Alric's spirit. You hear whispers at the market. You see girls mimicking your lines badly. You catch boys parodying your manifesto like it's a joke. Your voice has been hijacked again. Only now it's dressed in backlash. You light a candle, unroll your scroll, and write one line: "If I am the storm, you are the bucket left outside." Then you stop, because it's not enough anymore. You gather every scroll you've written, every public reading, every whispered parody, and decide to turn them into a collection, a real one, not for noblemen, not for revenge, but for girls like you. You call it Letters to the Loud Girl. You include everything, poems, notes, even your grocery list with that one rogue haiku. You decorate the pages with drawings. You give it to your poet friend. She gives it to a scribe. By next week, it's copied 12 times. By next month, it's circulating in nearby towns. And by spring, you hear someone quoting your goat metaphor in a different dialect. You smile, because even when your name gets scrubbed off, your voice remains. And that's louder than any accusation. Later, a messenger arrives, nervous, young, holds out a scroll. This came for you, he says, from the capital. You frown. I don't know anyone there. It's from the Queen's library. You blink. Inside a formal request. They want to archive letters to the loud girl for preservation. You reread the letter 3 times, and then you laugh out loud, because suddenly you're the story, not the muse, not the metaphor, not the side note in a knight's legacy. The author, the voice, the record, the storm in the ink. The Queen's letter still sits on your table, edges crisp seal unbroken. You've read it so many times, the words live in your head now, drifting through your thoughts like old lyrics from a song you once swore you'd never forget. You never imagined this, not when you scribbled your first sarcastic line in the margins of a flower receipt. Not when you read your own poems to a wall because you thought no one else would care. And certainly not when you burned those anonymous notes in a fire that smelled faintly of old parchment and chicken feathers. But now your words, your scrolls, are going to the Royal Library, the same one that stores royal treaties and ancient maps, and one lock of the Queen's baby hair, allegedly. And you just wrote, "My heart is not your props department," on page 3 of your poetry collection. You wonder if they'll shelve it next to the Book of Prayers, or the recipe book for medieval aphrodisiacs. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Royal courts across Europe often collected and preserved writings from poets, especially those with cultural influence. Queens, in particular, sponsored libraries of women's work, not always for its artistic merit, but as a gesture of political alignment with emerging literate classes. Your book is becoming more than a collection. It's a statement, and not just yours anymore. Your quirky tidbit, One Medieval Queen, funded a poet in residence whose only job was to write roasts in verse about the Queen's enemies. One of her poems was later mistaken for a prayer and sung in a church choir for 40 years before someone read the 3rd verse about Sir Dungface the Loud. You chuckle. History is weird like that. Still something nags at you. The church. For weeks now you've heard murmurs from the local priest, sermons about the dangers of ungoverned ink, references to women with loud parchment and louder mouths. No names, of course, but every side glance lands right on you. You know what's coming. Historians still argue whether church censorship was rooted in spiritual concern or just old-fashioned fear of social disruption. What we do know, poetry that challenged norms, especially from women, often ended up blacklisted, burned, or buried in special sections, labeled Moral Review. Your manuscript may be headed to the Royal Library, but the local bishop might want it in a bonfire. Then comes the visit. You're in the garden, coaxing your roses to stop dying out of spite, when two men in robes approach. Not monks, clerks. With that look that says, we carry scrolls and judgments. They ask you to cease public distribution of your writings. You ask why one clears his throat. There is concern about influence. You smile. I am influential. The other one says, the Queen may preserve your poems, but we decide what gets read aloud. You nod. Then offer them tea, because you're polite, and because the mugs say, world's okayest cleric, and you enjoy watching their eyebrows twitch. After they leave, you do the only thing that makes sense. You plan a reading, a big one, in the village square. You invite everyone, even the baker with his questionable onion tarts, even the goat. You read for 2 hours straight. Poems, old and new, funny and furious. And then, at the very end, you read a new one. If my mouth is a weapon, it's because the world keeps sending archers. If my scrolls are dangerous, it's because silence got me nothing but a lock on the door. The crowd erupts. Even the goat bleats approvingly. Later, your poet friend says, you realize this is war. Now you nod. If it is, I have ink. She grins. And a stage. You don't answer. You just look up at the dark sky. Stars blinking like curious punctuation marks, and wonder how many poems were buried before anyone got to read them. Not yours. Not anymore. The day your book finally leaves for the capital, it rains. But not the angry kind of rain, not the skies having an existential crisis kind. This is a soft whispering drizzle, the kind that makes leaves lean in closer, the kind that soaks into old wood and makes the world smell like fresh ink and wet stone. You watch the courier tie the parcel to his saddle with reverence. 12 handmade copies, each scroll bound with twine and marked not with your name but a simple phrase, letters to the loud girl. You'd insisted, because it wasn't just about you anymore. You don't wave goodbye. You just close the door and exhale. You don't need to watch the scrolls leave to believe they're on their way. You feel it in your chest, the strange stillness of having said everything you needed to say. For now, mainstream fact. Some of the earliest anthologies written by women were smuggled to royal courts, not through official scribes, but via traders, couriers, even pilgrims. The goal was preservation, not permission. If the church wouldn't keep it, the crown sometimes would. And sometimes that was enough. Quirky tidbit, one famous female poet in northern France signed her anonymous scrolls with a tiny embroidered squirrel sewn into the corner. Her identity was never discovered, but her verses survive in 5 different archives. One even has ink paw prints from a cat that walked across the parchment mid-writing. She remains unnamed, but unforgettable. You like that. But just when the rain fades and the quiet returns, a messenger arrives. Again. He's drenched, breathless, and clearly not thrilled to be the bearer of dramatic news. He hands you a letter, a royal invitation. You blink. You read it twice, then a third time aloud, just to hear it in your own voice. They want you in the capital, to read, to perform, not in a market square, not beside a puppet show, in the Queen's private court. You imagine the room, tall ceilings, too many candles, polished floors that echo like a stage. You wonder what your voice will sound like there. You wonder if they'll laugh in the right places, if they'll squirm during the sharp verses, if they'll see you as a curiosity or a catalyst. You're not sure, but you say yes anyway. Your poet friend helps you pack, which is mostly her making lists and you getting distracted by trying on too many cloaks. You'll need armor, she says. You raise an eyebrow. They're just nobles, not dragons. She smirks. Same thing. Fewer teeth, more gossip. She wraps your scrolls in linen and slips a small note between them. You don't read it. Not yet. Not until you're far from home. You ride out at dawn. Same boots. New ink stains. Same voice. Louder purpose. As the village fades behind you, you think of every girl who handed you a messy poem, every widow who whispered, "Thank you for saying what I never could," every priest who pretended not to look pleased when your satire landed just right. You are no longer a footnote. You are a full page. And this time your margins are wide. The Queen's court is quiet, the way a sword is quiet, gleaming, patient, and entirely capable of slicing through your confidence with one look. You arrive in shoes that aren't broken, in a cloak that doesn't quite sit right, and scrolls tucked under your arm like a child clutching secrets. You've been rehearsing the same 4 stanzas in your head since breakfast, and still your mouth goes dry when the chamberlain announces your name. Only he doesn't say your name. He says, "The voice of the loud girl scrolls." The room turns to look at you. You walk forward, not quickly, not timidly, like you've read this moment in a poem 1,000 times, and now it's simply your turn to be the verse. Mainstream fact courts often invited poets, jesters, and musicians not merely for entertainment, but to test the air, to see what the people were whispering beneath their breath. You are here not because you are loud, but because you were heard. The Queen leans forward slightly. No crown, just soft braids, and a look that says she's read your work twice, once for content and once for subtext. She nods. That's your cue. You unfold your scrolls. The first poem is light, witty, a jab at metaphors, a wink at overuse. The room chuckles. The second lands sharper. You quote that infamous red ink poem, then dismantle it line by line. One courtier flinches. By the third scroll, you're no longer thinking about performance. You're just speaking. And when you end the final line with, "Let me not be sweet," but remembered. The room is silent. Then clapping, first polite, then real, then something closer to a roar. Afterward, a steward escorts you to a small alcove lined with cushions and overfed cats. The queen appears moments later. She sits, takes a long look at you, then says you wrote what needed to be said, and you said it. Beautifully. You blink. Even the bit about turning suitors into metaphors. She smiles, especially that bit. You talk for hours, not just about poetry, about laws, ink, freedom, ink as freedom. She asks if you'll leave a copy of your collection. You offer her the scroll from your boot, the one with the creased edge and smeared ink from nervous fingers. She accepts it like it's sacred. Later that night in the guest chamber, you finally open the little note your poet friend tucked between the scrolls. It says, "Say it like they can't unhear you." You fall asleep smiling. You leave the capital 3 days later, not with coin, not with a title, but with a promise. The court will sponsor public readings in villages across the region. They want girls to hear your words, not just noble daughters, all of them. You imagine a girl in a goat barn, scroll in hand, smirking as she reads her first satirical rhyme aloud to no one but a mildly judgmental hen. And you think, good, let them all be loud. Let them write loudly. Let them carry ink like firewood. Let them burn silence into syllables. You ride home through soft fog scrolls, lighter in your pack than when you arrived, because some of them now live elsewhere. They are read, recited, remembered, which means you are too. And as the road winds toward your village and the wind smells like wet soil and coming rain, you feel something lift from your shoulders, like the world made room for your voice and left the door open, just a little, enough for someone else to walk through behind you. The road is quiet now, the kind of quiet that hums gently at the edges of your hearing, like a lullaby without a melody, just rhythm and breath. Your horse's hooves pad softly against the damp earth, their rhythm lulling you into that in-between space where thoughts move slower and the world begins to blur into shapes and scent. You pass a field of barley bending in the breeze. A single crow watches from a fence post, not cawing, not judging, just being. Your scrolls rustle faintly with each step, as if whispering to themselves, rehearsing lines, even in rest. You think about everything you've said, and everything you haven't yet, and how beautiful it is that there's time for both. The sky deepens into velvet. The stars come out slowly. No grand entrance, just soft insistence. The kind of night where you can believe that words matter, that they stay, that even after your voice quiets, they echo. You loosen your grip on the reins. Let the horse choose the path. Let your body sway gently. Let your eyes drift shut just for a moment, knowing that home is somewhere ahead, and the wind carries your name, not as a warning, but as a song. You are not alone now, not forgotten, not just the girl with ink, but the one who dared to speak. And because of you, others will too.